And Musorgsky obviously went to that, and that's what kind of influenced him into writing this piece. And it just really came to him in a flash. Another example of his real genius, Saint John, what is it, on Bald Mountain, Saint John's Night on Bald Mountain. Uh, that he wrote in 5 or 7 days or something. Mozart, maybe we can imagine doing that kind of thing. I kind of go a step beyond that. I don't think I do piano or music or arts for the sake of other things. I think it's important for its own sake, and human development and growing our mind and, what are we here on earth for? I think Winston Churchill said something about when they were fighting in World War II. People said, well, we don't need all these instruments or pianos or whatever. Let's just get rid of this stuff and use it for the war effort. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something to the effect of, well, then what are we fighting for? If not basically, so for our culture, for our arts.
Hello, welcome to the show. This is And If Love Remains. I am very excited to have my very good friend, Dr. Elias-Axel Pettersson, with us today. Elias is a good friend of mine. He's a concert pianist. He has over 200 performances to his name. He has, is it 3 CDs that you have out now, Elias?
Three CDs.
Three CDs out. Solo pianist CDs out. Just a fabulous pianist, a wonderful musician, like I said, a good friend, and I'm excited to talk to him today about I think something that you'll all be very excited about. We're going to be talking about a wonderful piece of music, but before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about you. Tell me about yourself a little bit. Growing up, little bio. Where did you grow up? Where did you come from?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Mike. It's great to be on the show and really to talk about some things that are dear to my heart, music, and of course the piece we're going to be talking about. Thanks for the introduction. So I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was born in Sweden, actually, in Göteborg in Gothenburg, and but we moved to the States when I was very young and grew up mostly in Albuquerque up through high school and studied there. I had a wonderful piano teacher for most of my life there, from about the age of 6 or so till 18. And yes, I don't know how much you want me to expound upon, going through the rest of my career.
Well, I know
Or
you played the piano, but you also played the violin, I understand.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, so I actually started. It's funny, my first memory in life. We try to think of what is our first memory when we were kids, and mine is
Right.
of a violin lesson. And I've spoken to, subsequently to my parents about when that would have been. And I remember it's just a snapshot in my mind. So I remember the teacher on her knees. My mom went with me to all my lessons. My mom was on her knees and I was standing up with what turned out to be my first violin, which I still have. It's a little plastic violin, a little bit smaller than a 16th size.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, it's tiny. And that was when we were in Denver, and that was before. So my brother had been born as before we moved to Albuquerque. So we moved when I had just turned 3. So this memory was when I was, I think, 2.5,
Wow.
and that's my first memory. Yeah.
So were you that precocious, or is your family musical, or how did that happen? Where you were interested in violin, at least enough
Well,
to
I can't say that I actually chose to play the violin at that age.
sure.
It was certainly something my mom and my dad pushed or wanted. Maybe I heard it and liked it or something. And my mom was pretty musical. She danced when she was younger and sang. Her side of the family is Jewish, and so I came from a tradition of singing and that sort of thing. So music was always important. And also that side of the family, there are six grandkids. I'm sort of in the middle, and all of us took music lessons up to a certain age, so that was important. So yeah, I started on violin and moved to Albuquerque, and then I started piano when I was somewhere between 5 and 6. Probably closer to 6. And yeah, I actually have reconnected with my first piano teacher.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, she's retired, but she still teaches and moved back to Colorado. And I only took about 6 months with her, but very nice lady. And then I transferred to my teacher, Mary Beth Gunning, who was my first, major, I would say major teacher, and I studied with
Right.
her for 12 years almost. Um,
Wow.
Graduating high school, yeah. With we did Guild. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a sort of national program, and we did Guild, and I did the high school um, senior program. I think it's called the diploma program or high school piano diploma. So I received that after 10 successful years and doing some large programs. So yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds like a great upbringing, and from a musical standpoint. And did you, um, did were you kind of did people notice you as a guy who has talent, and we really just want to, um, you know, push him or encourage him?
Hmm.
It was that kind of your what happened with you, or was it natural for you? This like you had this grand desire to want to play, and
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard topic. First of all, the idea of
sure,
talent, and
sure.
certainly I was no genius, no, and I don't use that word very often. And prodigy, I don't use that word. I certainly wasn't one of those. And I was kind of, I guess, a big fish in a small pond in Albuquerque. There were some other very strong students as I was growing up. Some were in my studio, some were from other teacher studios, and we usually competed at the same things in theory or in piano or whatever. And I was very active still at that time with violin, and one of the top violinists in the city. And I was in the youth symphony program, which a very strong youth symphony program in Albuquerque. And I was with the conductor who's actually quite well known. He recently passed away, Dale Kempter, but a very prominent person and really got that program going. So I had a lot of support. I would say familial support was very important to me. I was lucky in that regard. They saw it as important. They certainly my mom, and she pushed me. She tells stories. She told stories. She passed away a few years back, but she told stories of me not having to be asked to practice. I always wanted to. Now I'm sure I had to practice sometimes too, and I know she asked me a lot of days to practice. But I think she wanted to
Right.
inculcate in me this sort of love and put it in my mind that this was my desire. This sort of child
Right.
psychology that she was using, and I think it worked because I grew to really love the piano and love music. I mean, I was torn even when I went to college. I didn't know whether I was going to study violin, piano, or I went as a bio pre-med major. So I was heavily into the sciences, and I really liked
Interesting.
science and math and chess. I was one of the top state chess players as a scholastic player, we say under 18, and now I'm one of the top, maybe 5 or 10 players in the state in terms of my strength, although my rating hasn't caught up. But anyway,
It will.
yeah. So
For those of
the
you, listening to in the future, we're in the middle of the coronavirus right now. So as soon as things settle down, uh, you know, Dr. Pettersson's going to be rocking and rolling on and getting that rating up.
I I don't know about that. We'll see. But
I,
certainly I had a lot of support from the family, a lot of support from my teachers at school and private teachers, and just I was in a culture that my family created, my mom created, of music being important and not just being a hobby, and as a teacher now, I see how imperative that is for the families to really step it up and make music one of the focal points. And you can't just say, well, the kids will do it on their own. They'll practice. They'll get their work done. No, it's not like that. And I meet
Right.
tons of adults too that say, "Oh, I wish I could play piano now. I just didn't have the talent." And um, maybe that's the case to be somebody like Evgeny Kissin or something. One of these amazing pianists. But just to play, you can get quite far if you have I say the trifecta, like the good student, yes, but a good teacher and a good family support system. Uh,
Right.
and you can really get quite far. So, yeah, I had
Well,
all
and I
those
think,
things working in my favor.
I mean, my personal theory is that talent is really more of a measure, or what people call talent is more of a measure of desire, almost than anything else. I think there's some things that we're born with.
Hmm. Hmm.
However, some of that is desire. Like some of that desire we're born with. Which takes me to the next question, and you mentioned a couple of things of how important, and we haven't talked about this at all, but
Hmm.
so I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how important
That's fine.
is culture? Like
Mm.
the culture of having these youth symphonies and strong piano guilds, as you call it, and things like that, that allowed people, that gave people, young people, the opportunity to experience music on that kind of a level. How important do you find that?
Oh, very. I mean, you brought up, we could talk for an hour on just this, and I'll try to tackle a couple things. One is that music is still using the sort of barred system, which most fields or genres or whatever have not, they don't use as much anymore. It's the one-on-one, and it's costly in many ways,
Mhm.
but it's so effective having the one-on-one teaching, the tutoring system. And nowadays it seems to be only wealthy people that can have all those private tutors.
Right.
I think our society and culture is realizing that the one-on-one time is necessary. In some ways, you just can't keep piling kids on teachers. I mean, look at how the public education has gone just in my lifetime. I'm 40 years old now, and um, the class sizes, have for the most part gone up, and we're just expected to have one teacher lecturing in front of 30 or 40 kids. It just doesn't work. We have so many different kinds of kids from so many kinds of backgrounds, and we need that individualized attention. So that's one part of music being very important. I like to say, we have uh, the STEM subjects.
Uh-huh.
I can't even remember what they are.
Science,
Science,
technology, engineering,
technology,
and
engineering, and
math.
math. Yeah. So I like to talk about STEAM, and this has kind of caught on the last few years, which the A is for the arts. Um,
Right.
and I don't see the arts as a superfluous thing. Of course, I'm biased because I'm in that, but I think I mean, there are numerous scientific studies showing the correlation between doing well in the arts and doing well in math, science, and etc. I kind of go a step beyond that. I don't think I do piano or music or arts for the sake of other things. I think it's important for its own sake,
I agree.
and human development and growing our mind and what are we here on earth for? I think Winston Churchill said something about when they were fighting in World War II. People said, well, we don't need all these instruments or pianos or whatever. Let's just get rid of this stuff and use it for the war effort. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says something to the effect of, well, then what are we fighting for? If not basically,
Exactly.
so for our culture, for our arts. Um, and I think that's important. And in the States, we're a young country relatively. I know people won't want to hear that, but if you look at
Oh yeah.
European cultures, for the Western world at least, we're a relatively young country, and um, we've become a very successful country, obviously, and some of that has led to decadence. And I won't get too much into that culture war or clash, but I think we've lost a lot of the uh, appreciation or respect for arts because they're hard and they take time, and they take energy, and we're in a much faster culture where we want things immediately. And now I sound probably like an old fogey, but we I think art is so important because you really have to dedicate to something and you don't see the effects immediately. You know, you might have to
Hmm.
dedicate yourself to learning a piece, and it's not like even a difficult math concept. You can understand that cerebrally, kind of get it, work on it. Okay, think about it, cogitate, for a week, and then yeah, okay, I kind of get it. Let's apply that to a couple problems. Okay, I get it. With a very difficult piano work, let's say it might take you a year to learn that piece, and then you might bring it back in 10 years and play it much differently and have more insight. I mean, it's a much longer range goal. Each
Right.
piece, it's like writing, a thesis for math, or I'm just trying to think of some correlation, and that's difficult for our culture and our society, and we just don't have the support around it. It's not built in that that's important. The value, it's very hard to evaluate and put evaluation on lessons and piano lessons. And so
Mhm.
people like me, people like you, we struggle, to offer or ask our prices, which are totally reasonable given our backgrounds. I have a doctorate. I've been playing piano since I was 5, so 35 years. I've been teaching 20 years. If I was working in any other in the medical profession, and I had 20 years under my belt and 35 years of experience, I wouldn't be making the paltry sums I'm making right now. But that's the nature of it, and we don't have that value in our culture. So I know I'm giving a long-winded answer, but the culture aspect is very important in our society.
So one of the things I encourage people to do, my students specifically, but my anybody who, when I'm able to have a conversation about music or about the art, is I'll talk to them about, for example, the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And
Hmm.
everybody is familiar with the Ode to Joy. I mean, everybody
Sure.
loves it. I love it. It's tremendous in so many ways.
Yeah.
But if you really want to appreciate the Ode to Joy, you cannot appreciate it unless, at a minimum, you listen to the entire symphony. You've
That's a
got
good
to
point.
go.
Yeah.
You've got to go through the process of listening to that hour plus symphony to really experience the ode to joy in the way that it was meant to be experienced. And
Yeah.
that's a minimum. I mean, to be honest, you should know some Mozart, you should know some Bach, you should know
Mhm.
some things, you should know
Yeah.
a few other things in order to truly appreciate it. But at a minimum, you should at least listen to the entire thing. And to
Yeah.
take an hour or an hour and a half out of a day,
Well, it's not that
um,
long, but it's long.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes in the 40s it was,
Yeah. Yeah.
but no. But to take the time to listen to it,
Yeah.
and to come to that culmination of the ode to joy, and to hear that in its full splendor is just
Hmm.
a wonderful thing. And you feel like you've it's like you've climbed a mountain. It's like, I did it. I appreciate this.
Hmm.
And which kind of takes me into the piece that we're going to discuss, which is Pictures at an Expedition. And I'm going to start kind of at the end a little bit with that, with
Sure.
where we're going is is why this piece? Why should people spend a few minutes and listen to this piece? Um, and maybe this is the wrong spot to put it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Why should people
Oh, that's
listen
fine.
to Pictures at an Expedition?
Yeah, a picture at an expedition is a phenomenal piece and has so much built in around it, sort of the enigmatic stuff. It's just almost a mystery. But also, I wanted to touch on that concept of listening to a large scale work like Beethoven's Ninth or Pictures. And there's a lot to be said for putting in that time, and also difference between hearing it live and hearing it on a recording or on YouTube or something. There's nothing that can replace that live experience. And I think it's apropos to talk about that now, because during this coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, we're really missing the interaction in person. And so we're realizing that you just can't get the same effect when you do something online. And I would say a lot of universities and schools have been going online the last decade or so and thinking that's the solution, and it isn't. That isn't the solution to our education. And I think people are starting to realize how important that is. And so going to a live concert, again, taking us back to the original question about my upbringing too, we went to as many live concerts as we could, or they could be classical concerts, they could be comedy things with music. One of my first inspirations was Victor Borge. We'll get into that later.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and then we went to plays. We had a very good CLOA, which is Albuquerque Civic Light Opera Association. And I was actually in The Wizard of Oz when I was 9 or 10 years old, and performed in front of something like 25,000 people over the course of 17 performances. And, being a part of that and going to play 5 or 6 plays, they're musicals basically a year, and going to symphony concerts and going to recitals, that was just made part of that experience of my growing up. And a lot of my friends were going to movies and going to school dances, and I didn't go to a lot of school dances. Maybe I regretted it at the time. Now I realize that I really enjoyed going to the concerts I went to. And
Right.
actually, I remember there was one concert I went to. Well, not a concert; it was a play, and it was at my high school. And the same evening, there was, I think I was in seventh grade, so there was a seventh grade dance going on. But we had tickets to the play, so I went to the play, and it was, can't remember the name, but it was something with like four women were the main cast, and there was one fictitious man that wasn't actually part of it, and they were play acting things that they would do in like the 1940s and 50s, activities based around a guy actually being there and serving them and doing things like in the ice cream parlor and this and that. And so they
Right.
needed somebody from the audience, and they just happened to go by, and we had come in a little bit late. We just saw the very beginning. Um, and I was, 12 years old, I think. And they saw me, and they said, "Oh, come on up." And I wasn't expecting anything, so I went up, and they gave me a fake camera and told me to take a picture of them in their outfits and at the ice cream parlor, and it was kind of cool. I was on stage for maybe 2 minutes, and then I went
Sure.
back to my seat. And it turns out later, the parents of one of my classmates, they were there, and they said, "Hey, that was so cool. We didn't even know you were in this play." I said, "I wasn't. They just called me." And they said, "Aren't you at the?" Their daughter was at the dance. I said, "No, I didn't go to the dance because I had tickets to this." Anyway, it was kind of fun. That
Oh,
that
that's
was just, an illustration of the priorities. So
well. That does
anyway,
go back to that does go back to that culture thing, and
mhm,
in fact, let's. I mean, you mentioned Victor Borge, who's just so phenomenal.
mhm.
Tell me who are some of your other influences, inspirations growing up?
Oh, well, that's, yeah, too big to name, but certainly, parents were big. My mom, especially, she came to all my lessons growing up until I was a certain age, where the teachers said, "Look, he needs to be more independent and do this thing on his own." And I was probably 8 or 9 by then, maybe 10, and taking
Right.
our lessons. So, she was always supportive, and my grandparents too. Her parents. I didn't know my father's parents. They were much older. He was the youngest of 10. And so I grew up in Albuquerque with my mom's folks and her immediate family. So they were very supportive. And even my grandfather, he knew how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb on the violin, and he played that at my birthday every year. He was born in 1910, so he was 70 years older than I was. Um, anyway, so they were big influences, the family. Also, my fellow classmates or studio mates. I always heard my studio mates playing in the studio recitals. We had those once a month, and then two major ones per year. And I'd hear a piece like, "Oh, that's amazing! I have to play that," and talk to my teacher. "Well, you're not ready yet, but you'll get there." And then concerts we went to. I remember some of my first. concerts of big name pianists. Um, let's see. I heard Yefim Bronfman when I was pretty young, and
Uh,
he's still one of my favorite pianists. I heard Richard Good when I was, gosh, I wrote a report on, oh, and was it Zoltan Kochis or somebody? Maybe it was Bronfman. I wrote a report on him for my sixth or seventh grade music project.
no
And
kidding.
so even back then, I didn't know that they were that famous or that big. I mean, this is also 30 years ago. They weren't at the height of their careers yet, but these are big names, and it was important to see. And I just was blown away by their playing. But one
Oh
of
yeah.
these that I remember a lot was Victor Borge, and he's so funny. And of course, I get a lot of the jokes now more than I did when I was a kid because I just understand it. But we went to a concert, of his, and our entire family went. My two aunts and uncles, and I think a couple of my cousins, my grandparents, my parents, and my brother and I somehow slept separately. I remember we were in the left um, third of the rows, probably 8 or 9 rows back. I can remember where we were sitting in that hall, and I think it was my ninth or 10th birthday. I have to look if I can find the ticket, if it's from 89 or 90. And we uh, we wrote a note to Victor Borge, or my mom. She had this idea. She was always going above and beyond and trying to get stuff and get in the back door for things and give me opportunities, and my brother too. Um, and so we wrote a note, and Victor Borge, is Danish, and we're Swedish background. My father's Swedish, so
Okay.
Danish and Swedish are similar enough for writing. So we wrote the note in English. I think my father wrote the part in Swedish. My mom claims we wrote something in Hebrew, but I know she doesn't write Hebrew fluent, so I don't think we did it in Hebrew. I'm pretty sure it was English and Swedish. We gave it to the stage manager in the back, which turned out to be his son, Victor Borge's son.
Oh
Anyhow,
wow.
he gave the note to Victor Borge. So Victor Borge, the first half, he did the whole thing, and then he announced at the second half, he came out and he said, "There's a young man in the audience celebrating his ninth or 10th, I can't remember, birthday, and would he please stand up or something?" So I stood up and I was in the front row, and he made some quip about, "Oh, you two have been." My brother was like 7 or 8 at the time, but he was
Uh-huh.
he had gone to concerts too, so he was very well behaved. And they said, Victor Borge said, "Why can't the rest of you be respectful and quiet like these two boys or something?" Always picking little, pointing out things. So anyway, I said, "It's an I was kind of embarrassed, but hi, and my name is Elias-Axel Pettersson, and I'm such and such years old." And he said, "Okay, I'm going to play something for you." And then he goes off into a spiel with the happy birthday, with various styles by different composers.
Uh-huh.
So Mozart style, Chopin style, and I don't even remember so much the playing. I just remember standing and him talking, and then we went to meet him backstage later and got some pictures, and
Oh,
yeah,
how
so
wonderful.
it was pretty cool. And then when Marvin Hamlish, I don't know if you know him, he's a great pianist, entertainer, and I don't know if he passed away. He'd be pretty old now. Victor Borge passed away like 10 years ago. But Marvin
Right.
Hamlish came to town a few years later, and my mom did the same thing for my brother on his birthday. So we went, and then Marvin
Oh wow.
Hamlish introduced my brother and played some happy birthday thing for him. So I got Victor Borge, and my brother got Marvin Hamlish. Pretty amazing.
That's pretty. Oh, that's wonderful. What a great story. That's
Yeah.
stupendous,
Yeah.
man.
But anyway, back to the live, listening and going to live concerts
Right.
and spending the time. And you mentioned sort of understanding something and you get a lot more out of it. That's another interesting topic because I talk to a lot of non musicians when they go to my concerts or recitals. And I've played a lot. I think you mentioned 200 recitals. I think I've played now up to 600 performances, solo or chamber, and I'm not including the orchestral.
Well, I only shorted you by 2/3.
Yeah, but anyway, I'm not like Zimmerman. I'm sure he's played over 5,000 concerts. But yeah, these people are incredible. So I think it's very important when I've spoken with non musicians at my concerts, and they say, "Oh, I love that piece, and it touched me in such a way, And sometimes I relate, but sometimes I don't because I don't know what it is to remove myself from the understanding that I have because of my
Mm.
background and my knowledge of the piece. So sometimes I hear pieces, and I went through a long phase in my life where I was fairly judgmental of classical performances, let's say, of especially pianists and violinists. So I'd hear something and I would just find myself being judgmental of the piece because I knew the piece well. I knew the technique and how to play it and, the musical phrases, whatever, instead of just enjoying the piece for what it was. And I think a lot
Right.
of non-musicians might not have heard the piece or might have heard it and don't remember it, and they can kind of experience it as a first time thing. So there are advantages and disadvantages. I think the advantages to knowing a lot about it outweigh them, because if you can enjoy the piece for how great it is and understand all the things that are involved, and the real difficulties of what it takes.
Hmm.
So, somebody might watch me, and the two comments I always get asked, and I've played at a lot of retirement homes before, and two comments are always, how do your fingers move that fast, and how do you memorize
Right.
all those notes? And those are two kind of not misguided, but they don't understand what's behind that, how memory works, um,
Hmm.
how physicality works. So I always say, can you wiggle your fingers like this? And almost all of them, even those with arthritis, can wiggle their fingers fairly quickly. And I said, so
Right.
your fingers can move just about as fast as mine, maybe not, but it's the coordination, and that's all in the mind and the body and the bigger muscle groups, not necessarily just the fingers. And then memorizing is another misunderstood facet of not just music, but anything. And now there are TED talks on a lot of this kind of stuff, and we realize with a lot of the advancements in brain cognition that we do things like chunking, which
Hmm.
wasn't talked about, decades
Which
ago.
musicians have known for. I mean, we've known that for a long time. That's how
We've
you
known that for a
memorize.
long time, but it hasn't been in the scientific community, let's say, as long. And the whole concept, we don't memorize a piece and every bit of information like a computer would, the O's and
Right.
zeros and ones of, okay, there are 10,000 notes in this piece. I have 10,000 bits of information. No, we memorize in groups, in physical gestures, in harmonies, in melodies,
That's right.
and then all those are broken down. But
It's more.
that's how
Sometimes it's more like a dance.
yeah, yeah. The choreography is very important, and that's important to teach too. And I don't mean the sort of, not to pick on Long Long too much, because he is a fantastic pianist, and but but he really has a lot of choreography to his playing, and I think it sometimes detracts, and he almost adds the choreography. I'm not talking about adding the choreography. I'm
Right.
talking about realizing, where does your hand need to go, what kind of motion do you need for this passage, all those
Exactly.
technical things. That's choreography. So
It-
yeah. Anyway, I know I'm getting off point a little bit, but
no,
I
this is
think
beautiful.
yeah, sure.
This is exactly right. I love it. So let's take it back to pictures for a minute.
Yeah.
I know that you actually use this as your doctoral thesis. Talk
Hmm.
about that process. How did you decide to do that?
Yeah, that was, I mean, it's been a piece in my mind for many years. I don't know when I first heard it. I'm sure I heard the Ravel orchestration, which we'll get into
Hmm.
first, before I heard the original piano version, or other versions. There are many. And, that was when I was even thinking about applying for doctoral degrees. I wanted to have a project in mind and a topic in mind, so that I wouldn't be scrambling while I was doing the degree, and I could focus more on the degree aspect. So even before I applied to University of Montreal, where I ended up doing my doctorate, I'd already recorded pictures and I'd already worked on the piece. Actually, my first lesson was with Sergei Babayan on this, and it was a phenomenal lesson. And I played it for a couple of my other teachers or colleagues. And it was in my mind, and there's just so much richness to the piece. The story behind it is so fascinating, And I just thought there's so much to be done with this. Now, there's obviously a lot written about it. It's a very well studied piece, but I hadn't found as much, or I'd found a lot of conflicting information. And so I thought this is something I can add to, because I didn't want to do what a lot of doctoral students do for their theses and just kind of rehash something that's been done. And I wanted to try to avoid that, even though I was doing a famous piece. So I wanted to take it from the
You
aspect of
certainly didn't do
performing.
that. By the way, I've read your thesis, and you certainly didn't do that. It's
Oh, good. Well,
very interesting.
one of the books actually that almost dissuaded me was by Michael Russ, and this was one of my main. It's in my bibliography. It's a phenomenal book. It's very small, in fact. It's maybe 50 pages, and it's a little book. But the amount of detail that he goes into, both historical, analytical, technical, looking at the musicological aspects, the ethnomusicological aspects, like the Polish, and there are influences from four or five
Wow.
different cultures and languages in the piece. That also interests me a lot, just the
Right.
international variety or flavor of it. There's a Jewish flavor to a couple of the pieces, the Shmuel and Goldenberg, or Samuel Goldenberg. Um, and there's one other one which was kind of alludes to the Jewishness, but it's more of the Polish ghetto, which at that time would have mostly been Jewish in the late 1800s or mid 1800s. But anyway, I like that. There's a French aspect to it. There's the Italian influence. Of course, there's the Russian influence. And I just love that aspect. My family, my mom's side of the family is from, well, it's hard to say Russia, but from areas around Minsk and Kiev.
Hmm.
And so now
Okay.
Kiev is Ukrainian, but in the 1800s, because I think my great grandmother emigrated in 1905 or something. One of my great great grandparents came over on the Lusitania,
Oh
and
wow.
I mean they came over with nothing, and they
How,
moved to the
how cool is
Midwest,
that?
and they were farmers, and they grew up, and all my family on that side became farmers basically. um,
Yeah.
and the peasants, and so that also reminds me in pictures. There's a lot of that peasant feel, and not just
Right.
the pesante, but the feeling of coming from the countryside, and so that
Well,
drew
yeah.
me to
There's a real folkness to it.
folk
You
element. Yeah,
know.
that's a huge part of it, and so I was drawn to that, and that my ancestors were kind of from those areas, whether the city was owned by Kiev or Poland or Ukraine at the time, or Bielorussia, whatever it was. uh, and that's so cool. So there are so many facets of the piece that I loved. It's such a raw, powerful piece. It's a large scale work. It's one of the big, monuments of the piano literature of the Romantic era. It clocks in between 26 and 43 minutes. We'll get into that. It's sort of the most versatile in a way, large romantic work. I mean, if you look at another,
Yeah.
thinking of the large romantic works, Liszt Sonata, which is a pinnacle, the variations of recordings with Liszt Sonata, and there are hundreds of recordings for that. Um,
Right.
they clock in between, I would say, 26 minutes and 34 minutes, on the long end, which is quite a span, but it doesn't compare to the differences in pictures. And why can someone play the same piece and it be so vastly different in interpretation? There's a lot there. So all of those aspects of the piece really fascinated me and drew me to it. And I thought this is something I can add to, and I can really make it a project.
it is kind of a personal piece. Like, I mean, I like how you talked about that, because it's, and I don't know if it is the folkiness of it, the they use a lot of
Peasant
um,
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, peasant stuff. I was gonna say pentatonic scales. There's
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of that kind of feel to it, that it feels very earthy, and so I wonder if that's a reason why it is almost like a personal journey for somebody to play that piece. I have not played it. I know you
Mhm.
have, but in listening to recordings of it and listening to it, it seems like a piece that if I were to learn it, it would be a very personal journey to get through that piece.
Yeah, it is, and it's almost daunting whenever you start a large scale piece, especially this one. I start playing at the beginning, and I think to myself, "Oh my gosh, here we go! I can't get up from my seat for 30." I played in about 33 minutes, and that's it. There, of course, there are sections and vignettes. They're sort of divided, but you have to connect over. You mentioned something very interesting, the pentatonic scale. And when I was studying this, I actually traveled to Bloomington, Indiana. That's where IU is, and there's a
Uh-huh.
composer out there, um, David Canfield, who's the president of IKVA, which is the Russian. Uh, um, the abbreviation for the Russian title of the piece. Um,
Okay.
so Kartinky Svistavsky, I have to actually remember how to say that. But I stayed with him for actually a week and went through his collection. He used to be the largest secondhand record collector in the world. He had a whole
Oh
house of,
wow.
I don't know, 60, 80,000 records in his house. And now records are not as not as well sold, although they're coming back.
They're
But
definitely coming back.
they're definitely coming back. Yeah, vinyl is coming back. So I studied with him, and he mentioned something interesting, especially regarding the pentatonic scale and some of the recordings of more recent years. There are a lot of Asian pianists, Chinese, Korean mostly, Taiwanese, Japanese, and some from Thailand and some other Southeast Asian countries. And the reason why this particular piece resonates, this is part of his theory, but kind of what he's seen,
Uh-huh.
resonates with them is because a lot of Eastern music, if you think of Peking opera or traditional Asian, like Chinese folk music, which isn't based on our 12 tone Western scale, a lot of that is based on pentatonic things. So,
Hmm.
so something like Pictures, which has pentatonic elements in it, suits that culture very well and kind of resonates with them in a way that something like Liszt Sonata or Chopin, one of his three sonatas, wouldn't. And that's kind of
Right.
fascinating that this piece can transcend different cultures. And I think that's partly because of how Russia was situated. Some part of Russia is really part of Asia, and some part of it is very closely
To
akin to
Europe.
Western Europe. And so they kind of straddle both of the main cultures of the world, or hemispheres, let's say, of the world. And they have influences from those. And like I was saying, this piece is so international. Um, he's drawing from a lot of these other influences. So yeah, I think later on Debussy and those folks started to also be very interested in what was called the Orient at the time. If you
Right.
look at Pagode in Debussy, and like they're drawing on the Japanese temples, Chinese temples, and that sound, the pentatonic sound, is very prominent in Debussy's works and Ravel and Satie. But Mussorgsky is coming 30, 40 years before them, so it's pretty
So
interesting.
let's talk about him a little bit. Let's talk about Musorgsky and who he was, and leading up to writing this piece. Like,
Mhm.
so who are we talking about? Who's this composer?
Well, he's a very enigmatic person in a way. I mean, he had a very good lifestyle, I would say. He was born obviously into landed gentry, so his parents, I don't know what titles they had, but certainly they owned serfs. And this was before the emancipation of the serfs in Russia. And I looked that up last night. I couldn't remember, so I was looking at my thesis. It was in 1861, and Mussorgsky
Okay.
was born in 33. So um, 1833. So of course or sorry, it's 1839. I was thinking of another one of the Russian five. He was born in 1839. So by the time the emancipation came, he would have been, what, 21, 22 years old. And that would have affected his life a lot. I mean, it's hard to really claim any, like, oh, too bad you lost all your slaves kind of thing. But
Right.
the serfs at the time got to be landowners themselves, and usually the serfs from a particular landowner, they stayed in that area and they became more independent, let's say. It was still a hierarchical, very classist structure, but Musorgsky was born into the more upper class, and as such, he had that career kind of laid out for him of going either into military or governmental service, which was pretty common. Now, his dad died when he was younger-ish, and his mom, that was a big loss to him too when his mom died. He had a brother, Philaret, who was, I can't remember the age difference, but only a couple years difference. So he had the good things, in his life and a good upbringing. I would say today, if we looked at him, um, we might find some disorders or personality. We didn't know them back then, but there might be
Hmm.
some bipolarity. I don't know if that's ever conclusive. He was certainly a dipsomaniac. He drank a lot, and that's one of the reasons that led to his ultimate demise at the age of 42, quite young, actually. In
Yeah,
fact,
very young.
his birth date was 3 days ago, and his death date is in 3 days. So he died, a week after he turned 42,
Oh,
and
wow.
he became an alcoholic on and off due to whatever pressures or psychological pressures, and maybe he had some personality disorders which just were not taken care of. Um, and he certainly had a good friend group around him, the Mighty Five, the Moguchai Kuchka, with
Hmm.
that was Balakirev, Mili Balakirev, Cesar
He seemed
Cui,
to have some people that believed in him.
yeah, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Borodin. But and he had some supporters as well. Dargamishky was big, and Nadezhda von Meck, she supported a lot of that kind of Russian culture and those new composers. But yeah, he had some difficulties, and he was a struggling artist in a way. He was never that well off. He was always getting small little governmental jobs and working and trying to make ends meet while being a composer and being sort of on the front lines. The avant-garde per se. He was
Right.
really in the first and a half generation of Russian composers. I mean, before him, it was Glinka. Glinka was the father of Russian music, really, Russian classical
Yeah.
music. And Glinka was about 20 some years old, 25 years older or so. And between that was Dargomishky, who was a little bit older, but not so well known. But then you get the Russian Five, Borodin, the ones I mentioned. And they didn't have the tradition of like the European schools with going
Right.
back to Bach or Buxtehude or even in the English William Byrd, and Russia didn't have all of these. I mean, there probably were some composers, but they just were not of international fame. When I say international, I'm mostly speaking about the Western world, of course.
Right.
Um, so yeah, he had a very he struggled a lot. I think a lot of internal struggles, but he was a genius too, and a true genius. I mean, he could just have bouts of, he wrote pictures at an exhibition in the span of 3 weeks, and it just like
Wow.
came to him. And you can see in his sketches and in his letters. One of the books I used for my thesis was a compilation of all his letters to and from Mussorgsky in his life. It's a wonderful book, and it's out of print now, but it shows some of his sketches. He mostly wrote to Rimsky-Korsakov, who was a close friend, and occasionally Balakirev, who was sort of the older person in the group of five and the leader. And he was the one that had the most, let's say, European training or conservatory type training. Mussorgsky didn't have that. Obviously, he had teachers and very good teachers and leaders and mentors, but he didn't go through that conservatory system because it didn't really exist in Russia. It was his group that started the whole St. Petersburg school, and then the Anton Nikolai Rubinstein and Tchaikovsky were sort of the Moscow school, and those were kind of battling it out. And the Moscow school was more the traditionalist. The St. Petersburg school was more the avant-gardist. So
Was that the free music school? Is that what that was called? Something like that?
sort of, yeah. I mean, it's come down and it's changed names now. And so in Russia, you've got the Moscow Conservatory, which is the descendant of that, and the Gnesin School, which is for children, gifted children. That's kind of the descendant of that. In St. Petersburg, you've got their conservatory. I think it's something like free music school, but that's basically what they were, the free new music school, and they were more the on the edge, avant-garde stuff. The
There's
Rubinstein were more traditionalist.
and I want to get into a little bit. Well, let me ask you this. So coming into picture specifically, how did that happen? What inspired it? What is it roughly about?
Yeah, so he was, he wrote in 3 weeks. You can see in his sketches and his letters that he wrote, "Oh, I have this theme that's going through my head. I can't get it out of my head, and here it is, and here's this piece, and vignettes and whatever." And it's based on. So this goes back to another very close friend that he had, a sculptor, painter, architect, Victor Hartmann, who was another one of these, proud Russians Russia was proud of this rising star, let's say. Maybe he was the IMP of his generation, but he was designing everything. He was very young and very successful as a Russian architect, and he designed, or he had some drawings for some design of a great gate of Kiev, which was supposed to commemorate their 1,000-year anniversary, talking about old cities. And so Victor Hartmann was a very promising young artist and about the same age as Musorgsky, but he died. I can't remember. I think it was of a sudden aneurysm when he was very young. Maybe in his late 20s, early 30s. I'd have to look at his dates, but
Right.
that really devastated Musorgsky because it was one of his close friends. And what Stasov did, Stasov was another. He was a leading art critic, and some others, they kind of got together and said, we need to hold some sort of exhibition in honor of Hartmann, just to display all his works for the public to see, how great this artist was. And so they did that, and they had, I don't know, maybe 500-600 pieces of art, paintings, drawings, sketchings, sculptures, etc. And this whole exhibition at a large hall, probably some sort of convention center downtown. And Mussorgsky obviously went to that, and that's what kind of influenced him into writing this piece. And it just really came to him in a flash. Another example of his real genius, Saint John, what is it, on Bald Mountain, Saint John's Night on Bald Mountain. Uh,
Uh-huh.
that he wrote in 5 or 7 days or something.
No
He just
kidding.
wrote it, full everything. And it's like we can't imagine, Mozart, maybe we can imagine doing that kind of thing, but it's a
Right.
totally different, like we were talking about the other day. It's a different medium almost, or a different language that he's writing in. um,
Right.
this is a
When
much more
he in some
developed.
ways he's making up the language as he's going in a way.
Yeah, he
Obviously
is.
he's learned. He's not unlearned, but he's as you said on the avant-garde. He's making this up.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of new things, textures, ideas, musical gestures were being implemented. And we think of somebody on the opposite spectrum like Beethoven, who toiled and toiled and worked so hard. I mean, yes, he was a
Right.
genius, but the amount of work that he put into it, this goes back to the whole appreciation thing of pieces. If you look at some of his works, he has 12, 13 versions of something. I know when I
Right.
recorded one of my CDs is with the violinist, a chamber recording. We did the Spring Sonata, and if you look at just the melody, the versions that Beethoven went through to get it to that stage, it's amazing. If you look at the first version he had, it just it's a ghost of that. It's paltry in comparison, and the final product is so beautiful. But Mussorgsky, he toiled a bit internally, but when he was struck by inspiration, let's say, he just his ink flowed from his feather quill, per se, or his pen. And so this exhibition of Hartmann's works was the initial inspiration, and then the work itself, if we can get into that,
Yeah.
is a telling of the experience of going to the exhibition hall. And I think it's in fantastic programmatic work. We talk about music as being absolute music or programmatic music. And programmatic music follows a specific program or poem or story that's external to the music. Absolute music is more for the sake of itself.
Right.
Of course, when we teach, we try to introduce external things like, oh, doesn't this place sound like someone singing an aria or whatever? But that's not it's not
That's to
associated.
help people understand. Yeah, help people learn the language of it, before they
Yeah,
can. So
yeah. But
yeah.
but the pictures in the exhibition has a actual story with it, and he kind of guides you through. It's almost like a movie, but from the 1860s. This would have been their movie at the time. You go to the concert hall and you imagine yourself at this exhibition. And actually, I've seen orchestral concerts these days where they put a projector up with some of the old images,
Oh,
at
that's
least the ones that were
wonderful.
known at the time. And part of my thesis talks about the new images that were found that were unearthed or
Hmm.
discovered by a Japanese record or TV team in the 1990s. They found some other images like in a house that they think are associated or could be associated, might have been part of that original exhibition. And so I've included those pictures in my thesis. But I've seen people or orchestras that project those on a screen. So while you're listening, you kind of feel like you're going into the exhibition. It's really like a movie, but black and white almost. Well,
Right.
it's like pre-black and white movie. So
Well, the
it opens.
color, all the colors and the sound, he
Exactly. So
provides that.
you really have to imagine it, but it's so spectacular in the way he presents it, and you really feel that you're part of it. And he goes a step further in making you part of the exhibition towards the end. So that's one of my hypotheses in the thesis. Is it starts with a promenade, which in French, promener is kind of to walk, to wander. And the promenade is just the theme that we all know. Da, 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 da. And you're just the spectator walking along among the art exhibition. And then there's an art piece or a sculpture. Nomis is the first one, and you get all these little vignettes interrupted by the promenade. So you're walking around, and here's another vignette. Here's a painting. Here's a this or that. And by
Right.
the end of the piece, the promenade theme gets built in. So when you have the con mortuus with the dead, so he used Latin also as an inspiration, the Italian Latin thing, and you see the dead skulls in the catacombs in France and in Italy, and then that catacomb theme is actually the promenade theme as part of it. So you're actually the dead,
Wow.
walking, among yourself. And so it's pretty cool how Musorgsky brings the listener into the paintings themselves, and then you end with that eeriness before you go into Baba Yaga, which is the famous witch, in Russian
Uh-huh.
folklore, who eats children, grinds their bones up in a mortar and pestle, which she rides through the night screeching. I mean, it's very vivid, and it must have been scary even to hear this as a Russian child in the 1860s or 70s. And then after that scary aspect, the Baba Yaga, then you have the Great Gate of Kiev, which again was based on Hartmann's sketch of the Great Gate, which was one of the entries. I think it may be the winning entry for the government of Kiev, and they were going to build this Great Gate. I don't think it was ever built, or maybe it was using another design, but yeah, that's
Wow.
the
Well,
culmination. So,
we're going to have to do a part two
okay.
because this has been so great, and I hope you don't mind if we do a part two. But I think I have one more question, but I think this is a good place to put a pause on.
Mhm.
And here's my last question for that. To me, one of the interesting aspects, and we talked about this before, is that he wrote it for piano, and I understand that was his main instrument that he learned on and he probably understood the best. But he had done and has, and there are, uh, he's done operas, um,
Mhm. And
and there's some
orchestration. Yeah.
beautiful, yeah, there's some beautiful renditions of pictures as a full orchestra. So
Mhm.
why do you suspect he chose a piano to compose this piece?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were kind of discussing this the other day, and and we're all so used to Ravel's orchestration of this. That's what's come down to us. And actually, people don't
Yeah.
realize that was not the first orchestration of the piece. That was, I think, the third or the fourth orchestration. There's one done by Henry Wood. He's an English conductor, and even Rimsky-Korsakov came out with a version, not the complete piece, but a version of it. And even Ravel's piece, which is another controversial thing, is not complete. And he changes a lot of the original text, and it changes part of the meaning. And
Well,
so,
and there's a lot of that I want to get into the next time with the
yeah,
different versions that we have of it. But yeah.
yeah. But I think he didn't, had he heard those versions at the time, maybe he would have thought of that. He certainly was a great
Uh,
orchestrator, and Rimsky-Korsakov, his friend, was maybe one of the greatest ever. But he just had maybe that raw sound in his mind, and there's something to the piano sound that's individual and raw, and that's maybe just the technique. I think is very interestingly suited. It's not always pianistic or well suited, but it
mhm.
works very well. And I don't know why he conceived of it originally for piano. And if he had lived longer, maybe he would have made his own orchestration of it. I would have been very fascinated to hear that. But, he died too young. So we'll never
Right.
know exactly the reason, but certainly the
And
piano
you
version.
told me, and I like this, that it is kind of a chicken and the egg. I mean, this is how he thought of it, and now so many people hear it as an orchestra piece.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
you know
That's
what
our,
came
our cultural
first.
baggage in a way.
Right? Exactly. Exactly. Well, I think we're going to end it here for now, and if you're up for it, let's do a part two,
Oh, I'm
and
up for it. Yeah.
because I want to get it, I want to dig into the piece a little bit more, and I'm very excited. But um,
Yeah.
so let's end with one thing, if because I hope that we've inspired some of our listeners to go out, reach out. If you haven't heard the piece, to search it out and to
Mhm.
listen to it. Where who would you recommend
Oh, to listen
people?
to.
Yeah, what would you recommend listening?
It's hard. When you were asking me these questions, I kind of made some notes, and there are so many different versions because as I was saying, it's such a, and you were saying it's such a personal piece. There, the different versions are so personalized, I guess. But some of the great ones to listen to, if you want your like standard incredible version that's just everything's all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. It's hard to beat Efim Bronfman, or even Barry Douglas. They have great recordings. If you really want something that's a little out there and interesting, Horowitz, he has an electric performance from Carnegie Hall. Beno Moiseyevich, phenomenal pianist, great effects. Pletnev, Mikhail Pletnev, in very interesting recording and some very odd effects. When I heard that the first time in the Kornmorchwitz part and the Catacombe, I was like, "What is he playing piano still?" It didn't
Huh?
sound like piano. He's doing some very interesting things with the sound and the overtone series. It's phenomenal.
Wow.
Richter has, the Sophia. Richter recorded it like 10 times in
Oh,
concert,
yeah.
and I'm sure he played it more. But the Sophia concert is very, very good. Capel has a great one. I think it's from the Frick collection. Maria Udina, she's one of the great Russian pianists, early Russian kind of Soviet pianist. Very good recording. Kisin has a great live one on YouTube that you can see. Rudolf Verkuzhny, some other interest. Pogorelic is a very controversial one. We can talk about that another time. It's very long.
Yeah.
Lilia Zilberstein, she's another great Russian pianist, good recording. Prokofiev, actually, that's the first recording of it. It's incomplete, but it's from 1923. If you can find that, that's
Oh, wow.
fascinating. And then
Yeah.
Brailovsky is the first complete recording in 1942. So those are, there were, when I did my thesis, 349 recordings of just the piano solo version. And I think I'm including 2 or 3 of mine in there. Now, of course, it's way more than that. But I
And of
listened
course,
to probably 100.
and the listeners have been listening to a few snippets of it here and there, and that's come from your recording.
Oh, good,
Um,
cool.
and so I'd also encourage them to go to your website and check out your recordings. You've got some beautiful stuff up there, Elias.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I'm updating my website now, so hopefully all that stuff will be available soon.
So what is your website? EliasAxelPettersson.com.
So it's www. Oh, I don't even have to say that anymore. eapettersson.com. So eapettersson.com. And it does have my CDs there available for purchase, and then it links to my YouTube channel as well. So I've got about 40, 50 recordings on that, or videos.
Uh, well, I hope people will check it out and take a listen, and then we're going to do a part two. So
Awesome.
this has been And If Love Remains with Elias-Axel Pettersson. Thank you so much, and thank you for
You're
being a
welcome.
part of the show.
Thanks, Mike.